Hi, and welcome back for part 2 of week 3, chapter 9, Magazines and the Age of Specialization. Since the 1740s, magazines have played a key role in our social and cultural lives in America, becoming America's earliest national mass media. They created some of the first spaces for discussing the broad issues of the age, including public education, the abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and literacy. In this lecture, we will look at the history of the magazine industry, the age of muckraking, and the political value of magazines and their connection to photojournalism. We'll look at the rise and fall of the general interest magazines and consider how magazines have specialized in order to survive in fragmented and converged markets. And we'll investigate the organization and economics of magazines and their function in a democracy. And finally, we'll look at alternatives to market magazines like zines that have presented different voices. What is a magazine? So a magazine is a collection of articles, stories, and advertisements appearing in non-daily periodicals. So they were typically published on weekly or monthly schedules and in smaller formats than newspapers of the day, which were still quite large broadsheets, and that made them much more easily transportable and cheaper to ship often. Because of the difference in schedule, they also tended to allow for more in-depth writing. Magazines first appear in the late 1600s, and the first of these are political magazines. They offered poetry, politics, and philosophy for London's elite and served a readership of about a few thousand originally printed material, and often were materials that had originally been printed in newspapers and political pamphlets. So magazines tended to be places to collect things rather than necessarily have original writing, but that changes over time. The first magazines in colonial America didn't appear until 1741 in Philadelphia, about 50 years after the first newspapers. This was largely due to a lack of a substantial middle class, widespread literacy, or the advanced printing technologies that were available in the UK. In the United States, magazines have a close historical connection to the post office, and so the first two magazines that were published in the U.S., the American Magazine General and the Magazine and Historical Chronicle, were both published by early postmaster generals. Growth of the magazine industry remained slow in the United States after the Revolution because of the high delivery costs and low subscription numbers, although most communities had their own weekly magazines by 1825. In 1821, the Saturday Evening Post, which would be the longest-running magazine in the United States, was first launched. Like most magazines of the day, it really didn't include very many original writings and instead borrowed many of its pieces from other sources. Eventually, the Post grew to incorporate news, poetry, original essays, and play reviews, and writings of prominent writers, including Nathaniel Hawthorne and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who would become important novelists of the day. Although the Post was a general interest magazine, it was also the first major magazine to appeal directly to women with its subsection, the Ladies' Friend column, which addressed women's issues. As the 19th century progressed, the idea of specialization and specialized means devoted to certain categories of readers began to develop. So these were religious, literary, professional, including American Farmer, American Journal of Education, and of course medical magazines. And this is also the very beginning of magazines that focused on women and girls as a specific group. In 1828, Sarah Josepha Hale started the first magazine directed exclusively to a female audience, the Ladies' Magazine. After 9 years and marginal success, it merged with a magazine, another rival magazine, Goody's Ladies' Book. In addition to carrying general interest articles, the magazine advocated for women's education, for work and property rights. Hale's magazine played a central role in educating working and middle-class women who had been denied access to higher education, and by which we mean really usually schooling after about 3rd or 4th grade throughout the 19th century. In 1870, about 12,000 magazines were produced in the United States. By 1890, that number had reached 4,500. And by 1905, more than 6,000 magazines existed. So you can see this little chart here that's also in your book that shows this sort of meteoric rise. And it shows that it continues even with just the slightest dip from 2014 to 2016. Part of this surge in titles and readership was the facilitation of the Postal Act of 1879. Like I said, the post office is an important aspect to distribution of printed materials in the U.S. And in this act assigned magazines a lower postage rate and put them on equal footing with newspapers, which could be delivered by mail, reducing distribution costs radically. Faster presses and advances in mass production of printing, conveyor systems, and assembly lines also reduced production costs and made larger circulation of national magazines possible. So we started to move from these sort of local community magazines to many more national magazines with wider readerships. As magazine circulation began to skyrocket, advertising revenue also soared. So the economics behind the rise of advertising was really simple. A magazine publisher could dramatically expand his circulation by dropping the price of an issue a little bit so people would find it more appealing, especially below the and he could do this even below the production cost of that single copy. But the publisher then could recoup that loss, so could make back the amount of money that he would be losing by selling the magazine at a deficit by bringing in more advertising revenues. Guaranteeing large readerships was something to the advertisers was important. So the magazine, if they could reduce their costs and expand their readership, they could then make more money from advertisers by showing them how much appeal they were. So the economics of this are that actually, in many ways, magazines don't really make any money from subscriptions. They make all of their money, if not more than they lose, in actually distributing from the cost of advertising. So you can see in an old magazine here some funny advertisements of the day. So everything from shoes to foot care to bicycles to chickens. You could buy chickens in the magazine as well. With better distribution and lower costs, now started to attract more readers. But to maintain sales, magazines also had to shift their content a little bit as well. And one way to do this was to focus on more sort of sensational or exciting stories, both fictional, like those we saw in Penny Dreadfuls in the book section of this week's lecture, but also in reporting. So yellow journalism, a style that peaked in the 1890s, emphasized high-interest stories that focused on sensational crime news, big headlines, reports on exposed corruption, etc., particularly in business and government, things that people wanted to read about from the working and middle classes. While some of yellow journalism was purely sensational to sell papers, and it has often been called the fake news of its day, a lot of it was also an important place for muckrakers or investigative journalists to tell stories that would push for social reform on behalf of the public good. So, for example, the Ladies' Home Journal and its editor, Edward Bok, led the fight against unregulated patent medicines, which at the time were often as much as 50% alcohol and usually included opium. So things that were being sold as medicine were really just intoxicants. And other magazines took on poor living and working conditions, exposed unsanitary practices in food industries, and joined the fight against phony medicines. And we'll talk a little bit more about yellow journalism and muckraking when we talk next week about newspapers, and then again when we get into public relations, the week that we have on public relations. But it's important to note that yellow journalism was really critical in being able to force policy change. So a book like The Jungle, which appeared serialized in magazines as well, was covering the poor working conditions and also the really unsanitary practices of production at the time. And this led to the Meat Inspection Act and a lot of other things that were really important for improving the working lives of people. The heyday of the muckraking era lasted until the mid-19-teens, when America was drawn into World War I. After the war and through the 1950s, general interest magazines were the most prominent publications, even more than Specialized, offering occasional investigative articles, but also covering a wide array of topics aimed at a broad national audience. A key aspect of these magazines was photojournalism and the use of photos to document the rhythms of daily life and radical changes that were happening around the country. It wasn't until the 1890s that magazines and newspapers even possessed the technology to reproduce photos in print media, but once they did, photojournalism became an important way to not only inform people of what was going on, but was to be sure that they could see the events that they were reading about. Photojournalism in America developed in part under the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. The WPA was a government initiative to keep people working during the Great Depression, when much of private industry was laying people off to save money, and people who were freelance workers, like photographers and things like that, were even more out of work. In addition to building infrastructure and employing teachers and things like that, the WPA also funded artists, writers, and importantly for our discussion, documentary photographers. The image on the left was taken by Dorothea Lange, a WPA photographer, in a series she did on migrant workers during the Depression, and it became one of the most famous photographs in American photojournalist history. Photojournalism has been of critical importance for not only documenting upheaval, but pushing for social change, including the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, the anti-war movements of the 1960s and 70s, and now for activists of the movement for Black Lives, and documentations of the effects of American occupation of Afghanistan, and numerous other concerns. While our book suggests that concerns over manipulation of truth and images has only become a concern in the age of digital manipulation like Photoshop, it's important to remember that photography has been manipulated since it was invented in different ways, and people have always used this fact to argue against the truth of an image when they disagree with what it's trying to say. It was staged or manipulated, or the people were actors, are very common refrains not only in our day, but all the way back to the beginning of photography. The ease of high-quality photographic reproduction gave general interest magazines a visual advantage over radio, which was at the time the most popular medium of the day. In 1920, about 55 magazines fit the general interest category, but by 1946, more than 100 magazines competed with radio networks for a national audience. The most significant of these was the Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, Time, and Life. Your book goes into great detail on these, so I won't here, but it's worth reading about them. The decline of the weekly general interest magazine, which is important for us, that had dominated the industry for 30 years, began in the 1950s. Although Reader's Digest and women's supermarket magazines were not greatly affected by television, other general interest magazines were. The Saturday Evening Post folded in 1969, Look in 71, and Life in 1972. And these were at the height of more specialized magazines, but also the expansion of news broadcasting through television. So people were able to get their information in different ways. First, to maintain these high circulation numbers, publishers were selling magazines for less than the cost of production, and the national advertising revenue pie that had helped make up that difference in the past that we talked about was now having to be shared with network television, and magazine slices were getting smaller. So it cost more to have a single full-page ad in Life than it did to buy a minute of an ad during the evening news. And for advertisers, television advertising seemed to be more lucrative, so they decided to spend their revenue that way. National advertisers were forced to choose between the two, and in the 1960s and 70s, television always seemed to be the better choice with a broader audience. The domination of specialization. Magazines traded their mass audiences with the death of general interest magazines for smaller, discrete audiences that could be guaranteed to advertisers. So magazines are now divided by advertiser type. So consumer magazines carry a host of general consumer product ads. Business or trade magazines would include ads for products and services for various occupational groups, and then farm magazines would include ads for for agricultural products and farming. Another way magazines are divided is by target demographics. In addition to grouping magazines by advertising style, we also think about who the consumers are and what styles and interests they might have. So target audiences can include groups divided by gender, by age, by ethnic group or minority, and by an audience interest area such as entertainment, sports, literature, or tabloids. Specialized magazines often traffic in stereotypical ideas of gender, with women's magazines promoting unattainable goals of youth and beauty, facilitated by ad revenue for companies that are selling products designed to appeal to and create insecurities that the products themselves then supposedly address. We'll look at this in greater depth when we look at the concept of cultural imperialism, which we also talked about briefly in the book section. And increasingly, men's magazines are similarly constructed around unattainable ideals of masculinity that advertisers use to sell products. In the age of specialization, magazines further delineated readers along ever-narrowing lines, including age, catering increasingly to very young readers or very old readers, groups that tended to be ignored by other mass media sites like television. And we can see here that at this moment, that in 2017, the largest still existing magazine sales are coming from two magazines that are both targeted at the organization of retired persons. So the AARP, or American Organization of Retired Persons, is an organizational membership structure. Linking a magazine subscription to organizational memberships helps ensure audience loyalty to the magazine in the face of many competing media options. So we see here we have not only ARP, but Costco Connection and Game Informer for pro membership card at GameStop stores, AAA, which is related to an automobile organization, etc. Advertising and sales have long been connected to the magazine, as we've seen. They dictate a lot of how magazines function. The first magazines in the 17th century in France were packaged in the form of bookseller catalogs and notices that book publishers inserted into magazines. So the word magazine, in fact, actually derives from the French magasin, meaning storehouse, is deeply connected to the notion of catalog. A Magalog is a promotional copy of a magazine sponsored by advertisers, usually in 12-page catalog format, and the name is a portmanteau of magazine and catalog. The Magalog often works to introduce a reader to another magazine while also advertising products that branch the lifestyle from one magazine to another. So in this case, this is a Magalog for O magazine that would have appeared in another magazine that would have been published by a publisher owning both of those magazines as a way to introduce one readership to another magazine. These are ways for magazines like Time and Condé Nast, who own multiple magazines of similar but slightly different niche markets, to increase their magazine audience bases. And you can see here that, like many other things we've talked about in digital technology, the conglomeration of publishing houses has gotten really extreme. So Condé Nast owns all of these, among many others: Vogue, Glamour, GQ, Traveler, Tatler, House and Garden, GQ Style, Brides Magazine, World of Interiors, Vanity Fair. And some of these seem to be direct competitors, but in fact actually are all still benefiting from the same audience group. So while Vogue and Vanity Fair might appear to be magazines that would be competing, because they're both owned by Condé Nast, purchases of either actually still support the same publishing house conglomerate. Given the costs of paper, printing, and postage, and the comparative flexibility of the web, mobile devices, and social media, magazines are increasingly being distributed across multiple digital formats rather than being focused primarily on print. Although the magazine industry's platforms for reaching its audience might be changing rapidly, its total monthly brand audiences are actually increasing from 1.55 billion to 1.74 billion from 2014 to 2018. So the industry is extremely healthy, in part because of its ability to shift into digital formats, which is also likely well suited to the advertising models that we see on social media and other forms of digital media. As an industry, magazine publishing, like advertising and public relations, has played a role in transforming the United States from a producer society to a consumer society. Since the 1950s, individual magazines have not had the powerful national voice they once possessed, uniting separate communities around important issues, such as abolition and suffrage, that were foundational to the democratic possibilities of magazines. Today, with so many specialized magazines appealing to distinct groups of consumers, magazines play a much diminished role in creating a sense of national identity, and instead actually produce the same kind of niche markets we talk about a little bit when we think about social media and siloing. Contemporary commercial magazines provide essential information about politics, society, and culture, still helping us think through ourselves as participants in democracy. Unfortunately, though, these magazines have often identified their readers as consumers first and citizens second. And so in the same way that we see problems with social media being motivated primarily about getting a number of eyeballs on something, this is similarly the case with magazines. There's less of an interest in producing a sense of civic connection than there is in maintaining control over sales. At the same time, magazines have arguably had more freedom than other media to encourage and participate in democratic debates. We've seen this in recent years, where formerly dismissed as girls' magazines concerned with beauty, like Teen Vogue and Cosmo, have both emerged as critical political voices. So as we have seen with social media and other forms of media, magazines both offer information and platforms for debate, while also problematically yielding to the interests of advertising corporations. And that's something we're going to see across all forms of media, is this tension that we exist in the United States of a free press, but also a free press that's dictated by the market. So even in the face of this advertiser-controlled market of magazines, there are still potentials for alternative voices. We'll start with zines. Zines are hard to define. It's most commonly a small circulation publication of original and appropriated texts, typically mixed together in images. So just the history of magazines. It's some original and some reproduced. But more broadly, the term tends to encompass any self-published unique work of minority interest, usually produced via photocopier historically, but we'll talk more about the digitization of them now too. Most definitions of zines include the fact that they're also not funded by advertisers, although this is more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule. Kanye West recently produced a zine, which I think actually had some advertising in it, not surprisingly. Often zines are connected to subcultures or countercultures and political movements like punk or feminism or current mutual aid communities that have arisen in recent years, and specific demographic groups. These have permitted groups to communicate with each other and share resources or content that the mainstream media does not find profitable. Some have argued, so in the proliferation of e-publishing, there's a number of zines that have sprung up that are digitally based. And if anyone's interested, I'm happy to share some resources on those. I find them pretty great. Also, I've linked to an article in the module where some have argued that slide shares that appeared during the movement for Black Lives and during COVID that provided people with both information, graphics, and resources of who to reach out to, who to support, etc., have also built themselves on the model of the traditional zine and are equally invested in producing the communities and addressing their needs. In addition to zines, there are underground publications that are similarly related and other political magazines, some of which resist advertiser dollars. So things like Mother Jones that make very specific choices about what advertisers they work with because of their political motivations, and those exist on both the left and the right. So today, we saw in our look at books and magazines some of the same concerns we saw last week and will continue to see throughout the semester. With new and expanding technologies, we get increasing access and representations, which often makes people concerned about the state of society, whether because they see the media as a threat to morality or because they're concerned about the purity of the medium being diluted by low taste or mass interest. With expansion of production, we also see increased consolidation of ownership, which means that although we have seemingly more choices, the voices and interests of the very few are still being represented and served. books and print or other forms of textual media remain an important part of an informed society, regardless of the format. And people consistently work to expand the voices of those visible through these formats. So looking for alternative models is always an interesting thing to see as the world is continually getting more standardized by large corporate conglomerations. I hope that's been an interesting week for you guys. I'm going to post a third video on assignments for the week. So that'll be it for today for lectures. Have a good week, everybody. Bye.